In every video tutorial that I put together, I try to jump into writing code as soon as possible, but this is going to be one very rare exception because I want you to have a very good idea of all the terminology that we're going to use throughout this entire course. And so it starts right here. What does ES6 really mean? What is ECMAScript? How does it relate to JavaScript? What is all this stuff? So we're going to spend a couple minutes to just talk about what ES6 really means. ES6 is short for ECMAScript 6. So we are on the 6th version or 6th implementation of ECMAScript. One thing I want to make very clear from the get-go is that ECMAScript, like ES6 essentially, is a standard. It is a description of a scripting language. JavaScript is an implementation of that standard. So that is how the two are related. ECMAScript or ES6 is a standard. JavaScript is an implementation. So something that can actually run in your browser. ECMAScript 6 or ES6 can be thought of as a new version of JavaScript. That's really the easiest, we're kind of blurring some lines there, but it's really the easiest way to think of it. ES6 is a new version of JavaScript. There have been many versions before it. The vast majority, V1 through 3, or ES1 through 3, originally came out back in the 90s. Version 4 was slated for release in 2008, but it was somewhat famously kind of axed. So there never was a released version of ES4. It was kind of axed because of political disagreement between a couple different parties who were trying to figure out the spec. ES5 and 5.1 are the most recent and probably versions of JavaScript that you're most familiar with. So ES5 was in around, 2008. I think 5.1 is around 2011. 5 and 5.1, again, are the versions of JavaScript that you probably learned if you picked up web development somewhat recently. ES6, or ES2015 as it's also sometimes known, is the newest implementation. It's the newest version of JavaScript. So it contains a bunch of features that provide improvements to the language. Coming right on the tails of ES6 is ES7. Starting with ES6, which is again what we're going to be learning about in this course, you start seeing the terminology ECMAScript 2015. And so they're kind of moving away from these version counters of V6, V7, and moving more towards years. So ECMAScript 2015, ECMAScript 2016, with the thought process there being that they want to release a new version of the spec once per year. And so that's why personally you'll hear me refer to ES6 kind of interchangeably as either ES6 and ES2015. They're the exact same thing. They just are kind of changing the nomenclature there a little bit from versions to year designations. The only other thing I want to mention about ES6 code that we write in general is how we actually make use of it inside of our browser. So throughout this entire course, we're going to be writing some ES6 code. So we're going to be using these new forms of syntax, these new features, all this great new stuff. When we write ES6 code, usually the intent is that we should be able to serve it down to some user who's, down the street from us or halfway across the world as a JavaScript file. ES6 code has to be implemented by the browser that it's running on in order to run properly. In practice, we kind of make the assumption as web developers that chances are the vast majority of our user base might not have full support for the ES6 language or standard. So in practice, what we do is we write a whole bunch of ES6 code, we run it through a tool called Babel, which transpiles it, or kind of converts it would be a better word to think of, down to ES5 code. And so ES5 code was a standard that was released back in 2008, and we generally assume that ES5 code is safe to run in everybody's browser across the entire world. So as we work throughout this course, we're going to be writing ES6 code. I just want you to know that in general, we'll be converting it to Babel and then running it on our user's browser as ES5. Now this is the one very interesting thing, I think is personally very interesting, about ES6 code that we write. Right now, today, if I want to make use of some ES6 feature, I'm going to use Babel to transpile it into ES5, and then, okay, everybody's happy, right? Well, what happens in 5 years' time when we can finally make the assumption that everyone has a browser that is capable of running ES6? At that point in time, we might say to ourselves, oh, well, we don't need Babel anymore. We don't need to transpile our code. But I'm gonna bet you something here. As the years go by and we start getting newer and newer versions of JavaScript, like ES 2016, 2017, 2018, we are going to continue to use Babel to transpile our code down to something that can be safely ran in the browser. So it's kind of a very interesting form of lock-in that we're getting with Babel right now, where just because we're starting to use transpiling to turn our ES6 code into ES5, and as time goes on, we're going to want to say start turning ES7 into 6, and then 7 or 8 into 6, and then 9 into 7, or whatever the versions are, right? We're kind of forcing this kind of lock-in to Babel on ourselves just because we keep on progressing in versions to make sure that our code is safe to run in our user's browser. Anyways, I just thought that was kind of an interesting way of thinking about using Babel for all these transpiling needs. So we've got a better idea of what ES6 is, how it relates to ECMAScript, what the ES2015 nomenclature versus ES6 is all about. So let's continue in the next section and talk about the first line of features that we're going to be working with on ES6. I'll see you in the next section.